Hey there. Welcome to Dark Lullabies. How was your day? I'm so glad you're here, and I really hope I can help you relax and find some peace tonight. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Okay, let's get started with the first story. Story 1. I was maybe 11 the year this happened. Old enough to think I knew better than my parents, but still young enough to cry myself to sleep afterward. And even now as an adult, I can close my eyes and smell that damp Appalachian air and feel my chest tighten like I'm right back there again. I grew up in a little mountain town tucked into the Appalachians. The kind of place where the two-lane road snakes around the ridges, and you can hear coal trucks long before you see them, where everybody knows everybody, and news travels faster than the weather. Our house sat near the mouth of a narrow hollow, with a creek that ran behind the property and a steep ridge rising up behind it. And every morning, I'd bike into town for school along the main road that clung to the hillside like it was afraid of sliding off. It was a long ride for a kid, but my parents were always juggling shifts at the plant and the diner, and it just became our routine. They worked, I rode. I actually learned to love it, the feeling of coasting down the hills, the way the fog clung to the treetops in the early fall. It felt like my time, my little piece of freedom before the day really started. There was, however, one thing they were absolutely strict about. I was never, under any circumstances, to cut through the old service road in the hollow. The road started out as a gravel track just past our driveway and disappeared into the trees between our house and town, and my dad always said it was too overgrown, too easy to get turned around back there where the mountain folds over itself, where the creek splits and the old logging cuts all look the same. You stay on the blacktop, he'd tell me over and over. I don't care if it takes longer. No shortcuts through that hollow. People get lost back there. Around that same time, there had been a missing kid from the next county over, a boy maybe a year younger than me, whose picture had been taped to the window at the gas station we stopped at on Sundays. I can still see his school photo, the nervous smile, the too big polo shirt. The flyer said had last been seen walking near a wooded service road outside of town, and I remember my mom staring at it longer than she meant to, her jaw tight, before she steered me away by the shoulder. That poster stuck with me, probably more than anyone realized. It made the hollow feel less like just a patch of woods, and more like the kind of place where things could go wrong and never get fixed. Still, I was a kid. And kids are good at convincing themselves they're invincible. Most days, I did exactly what my parents asked. I stayed on the road, pedaled past the sagging barns and leaning mailboxes and rusted-out trucks sinking slowly into the weeds, and I never even glanced down the old service road. Over time, it just became background. On weekends, I'd ride for fun, following the ridge as far as my legs would take me, sometimes pretending I was racing cars that weren't actually there. Life felt simple in that way, kids' lives do when they don't know enough to recognize all the things that could go wrong. The day everything changed started out ordinary. I remember it was early fall. Cool, but not cold yet, with the first few leaves turning. That kind of golden late afternoon light that makes everything feel soft and harmless. I was biking home from school, my backpack thumping lightly against my shoulders, when my chain jumped the gear and snapped off with a sharp metallic jolt halfway up a slow incline. My foot slipped, my knee smacked the frame, and I almost toppled over into the ditch. I swore under my breath quietly, like a kid who knows he shouldn't, and hopped off to flip the bike over. My dad had taught me how to fix the chain more than once, but that day it just wouldn't cooperate. Grease got under my fingernails as I tried to pull the chain back onto the sprocket, but it kept slipping off, like it had a mind of its own. After several minutes, I realized what I didn't want to admit. I wasn't going to get it back on by myself. Standing there on the shoulder of that narrow mountain road, I did the mental math. Walking the whole way around on the blacktop, pushing a dead bike beside me, was going to take ages, especially with the light already starting to dip behind the ridge. I didn't have a cell phone. This was before kids carried them like they do now, and even if I had, there wasn't much service in that hollow. My parents were both working late, and I'd been drilled my whole life not to accept rides from strangers. So flagging down one of the passing pickups was out of the question. I felt very small and very alone. That's when I looked down toward the mouth of the hollow. The old service road was just sitting there, cutting into the trees off the main road like a forgotten trail. Gravel choked with grass, a narrow track leading into the shadows between the ridges. If I took it straight through, it would drop me close to the back of our property, near the creek, at least in theory. I'd stared at it on maps before, tracing it with my finger, curious about where it went. I knew exactly what my parents would say if they could see me weighing it. I also knew no one was there to stop me. I talked myself into it like kids do when they know they're making the wrong choice but can't resist. I told myself I'd just follow the road, keep going straight, no wandering off. The hollow wasn't that big. Not really. And I knew if I just walked and didn't get cute about it, it'd be fine. Besides, I was on the outside of town, not in the middle of nowhere. It'd be through before the sun was really down. That's what I told myself as I grabbed the handlebars and started pushing my bike off the pavement and onto the gravel, ignoring the way my stomach tightened. The air changed as soon as I passed the first line of trees. The sounds from the road, the occasional truck, the distant bark of a dog dulled and then faded completely, swallowed up by the canopy. The service road was narrow and rutted, with weeds brushing my shins and low branches snagging my backpack. On either side, the woods were dense, tangled rhododendron, hardwoods leaning over the track, the ground dropping off in places into steep, rocky ditches. The farther I went, the darker it felt, even though the sky above, where I could see it, was still bright. The mountain has a way of folding the light into itself, of making the day feel older than it is. At first, I tried to pretend I was on an adventure. I kicked a rock down the road ahead of me, listened to the crunch of gravel under my sneakers, told myself I'd have a cool story to tell as long as I made it home before my parents. But pretty quickly, the unease set in. The hollow was so quiet. No cars, no voices, just the faint trickle of the creek somewhere off to my right and my own breathing, louder than I wanted it to be. Even the birds seemed to be holding their breath. Every little crack of a twig sounded like something stepping just out of view. The first weird thing I noticed didn't seem that weird at the time, at least not enough to turn me around. It was a piece of rope, rough and gray, tied around a sapling at the side of the road, about chest height. At first I thought it was just some old marker from logging days. But when I stepped closer, I saw that the rope wasn't just tied, it was looped, with a crude knot in it that reminded me of a noose I'd seen in a movie once. The end of it hung there, frayed, swaying slightly even though there wasn't much of a breeze. It gave me a bad feeling I couldn't name, and I hurried past, telling myself it was nothing, that people used ropes for all kinds of things out here. I didn't let myself think about the poster at the gas station, or the fact that I'd never seen kids playing in this hollow. I kept checking over my shoulder without really meaning to, as if I expected someone to be behind me. The service road curved a little as it followed the line of the ridge, and every time it bent, I felt a fresh surge of anxiety. Like with every turn, I was stepping further into a place I didn't belong. Then, the second thing happened. I was pushing my bike up a slight incline when my front tire bumped something soft and half buried in the gravel. I looked down and saw a small shoe, caked in mud, lying on its side in the middle of the road. It was the size a little kid might wear, with faded cartoon characters on the side, the fabric stiff with dirt and weather. There was no pair, no sign anyone had just dropped it. It was just there, as if it had been sitting in that spot for a long time, waiting. My throat went dry. I nudged it off the path with my foot and kept moving. But from that moment on, it felt like the hollow was watching me. That's about when I started hearing the rustling. At first, it was just a faint shift in the brush to the left of the road, so soft I thought it might be my imagination, or maybe a squirrel or something small. I stopped walking, and the sound stopped too. I stood there for a long second, listening to the blood roar in my ears. When nothing else happened, I told myself it was just the wind, and started forward again. A few steps later, the rustling started again, louder this time, off to my right at the edge where the road fell off into a tangle of undergrowth. It wasn't constant. It came in bursts, like something big was moving, then freezing whenever I did. I stopped again. Silence. The hairs on my arms stood up. There's a difference between the random noises of the woods and the sound of something keeping pace with you, and my body knew it, even if my mind tried to deny it. I tried to breathe slower, to not let myself panic. My dad's voice echoed in my head, telling me black bears usually avoided people, that bobcats were shy, that most of what you heard in the woods was harmless. I tried to believe him, but I wasn't convinced this was an animal. I gripped the handlebars tighter, kept my eyes on the ruts in front of me, and walked faster. The rustling would fall behind me, then creep up again, always just out of sight, like whatever it was matching my speed. For a while, it stopped, and I felt my shoulders loosen just the tiniest bit. Maybe it really had been nothing. Maybe I was working myself up over every branch that moved. I remember thinking, if I can just make it to where the road bends toward the creek, it'll be almost home. The service road eventually split where another overgrown track cut off toward the ridge, and that's where I made my mistake. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it, and I figured if something was following me on this path, maybe I could throw it off by changing rows the way you might in a cornfield or maze. I turned off the main track and veered onto the side path, pushing my bike over the uneven ground, even though I didn't know that way as well. The trees closed in tighter there, branches knitting together overhead, turning the light into this murky, greenish haze. My breath was loud. For a minute, it was quiet, and I felt this tiny spark of relief, like maybe id shaken, whatever it was. Then I rounded a bend and saw him. There, standing dead center in the narrow path ahead of me, was a man. He was just there, like head grown out of the dirt while my head was down, arms hanging loose at his sides, blocking the trail. He wasn't dressed like any of the farmers or older guys I recognized from around town. His clothes were filthy, jeans dark with old stains, a tan work jacket ripped at one shoulder, boots muddy and worn. His hair was thin and patchy, flattened to his scalp like he'd been sweating, but it was his arms that really lodged in my memory. The skin was crisscrossed with long, angry scratches, some healed into thin red lines, others still raw and scabbed over, running in almost straight rows up and down his forearms like tally marks carved into wood. For a second, I thought that's exactly what they were, self-inflicted tally marks, but I don't know if that's true or just the way my brain tried to make sense of it. I stopped so fast my bike wobbled and nearly fell. My mouth went dry. He just stared at me, eyes flat and unreadable, like he was trying to decide what I was. There's a particular kind of terror that comes when you realize an adult is looking at you not as a kid, not as a neighbor, but as something else entirely, something they might want. When he finally spoke, his voice came out low and rough, like he hadn't used it much. He asked if I was lost. I don't remember his exact words, just the way they seemed to slide across the space between us, oily and wrong. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I felt like my feet were nailed to the ground. He took one careful step toward me, then another, saying he could help me, that he knew these woods better than anyone, that he could show me the quickest way home. Even then, even terrified, something in my gut recoiled at the way he said home, like he wasn't talking about my house at all. That's when I noticed what he was holding in his right hand, half hidden behind his leg. A length of rope, thicker than the frayed stuff he'd seen on the sapling, coiled loosely, one end already tied into a loop. My brain put that together with the shoe in the road, the missing kids poster, the rustling that had tracked me for the last 10 minutes, and every instinct in my body started screaming at once. At first, though, my body didn't listen. It was like being in a nightmare where you're paralyzed, where you know you need to move but your limbs won't cooperate. My vision tunneled, and all I could see was the rope and the way his fingers flexed around it. Then, all at once, something broke loose inside of me. I dropped my bike without even realizing it, the handlebars crashing to the dirt, and I turned and ran. I heard him react a half-second later, heard the sudden crunch of his boots as he lunged after me. He shouted something about just wanting to help, but his voice had shifted, the words sharper and more urgent, like he was angry it'd ruined whatever he had planned. I sprinted back the way it'd come, lungs burning, branches slapping my face and arms. Behind me, I could hear him crashing through the brush, not bothering to stay on the road now, just barreling forward. Every once in a while, I'd dart off the track and squeeze myself between the trees, trying to make myself small and invisible. Once, I slid down into a shallow ditch and crouched there, hugging my knees, pressing my back against the cold, damp dirt. I could hear him moving nearby, the sound of his breathing ragged and too close. Through the tangle of roots and weeds, I saw his boots pass within a few feet of my hiding spot. That close, I could hear him muttering under his breath, words coming out broken and uneven. "I'll find him. I'll find one. I'll find him." I don't know if he meant me specifically or someone else, but those words have been stuck in my head ever since, like a sickness I can't shake. I stayed in that ditch long after his footsteps faded, long after the woods went still again. My legs cramped, and my feet went numb, but I was too afraid to move. At some point, I started crying silently, my shoulders shaking, but I kept my hands clasped over my mouth so tightly my jaw hurt. The sky above the canopy dimmed from gold to gray to a kind of blue-black that meant it'd already been gone longer than I was supposed to. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, and that somehow gave me the courage to finally uncurl my body, drag myself up out of the ditch, and stumble back toward where I thought the service road had to be. The rest of that walk is a blur. I know I took wrong turns, that I ended up off the main track more than once, that the woods pressed in so tight I had to turn my shoulders sideways to squeeze through. Every root looked like a snake, every shadow like a person. At one point I tripped over a root and went down hard, my palms grinding into gravel, my breath knocked out of me. I lay there for a second, listening desperately for footsteps, sure I'd feel hands on me at any moment. None came. I forced myself up and kept going. Eventually, miraculously, I saw a thin stripe of fading sky through the trees ahead and realized it'd reached the edge of the hollow. When I stepped out onto the blacktop again and saw the familiar curve of the road, I thought my knees were going to buckle. By the time I made it home, it was full dark. The house was lit up, and I could see my parents' silhouettes moving frantically behind the living room window. My mom met me on the porch, sobbing, clutching my shoulders so hard it hurt, while my dad's face was a mask of anger and fear he'd never seen before. I told him everything in a choked rush about the chain, about the shortcut, about the man and the rope and the way Head chased me. My dad grabbed a flashlight and stormed toward the hollow with a fury I'd only seen in him when something really scared him. When he came back an hour later, his boots muddy, his jaw clenched, he said Head found the turnoff and the spot where my bike should have been. But there was no sign of it. No bike, no man, just the dark and the woods and that looping, empty road. They called the sheriff, who came out and took a statement while I sat wrapped in a blanket on the couch, my hands still shaking. He asked questions in a calm, practiced voice, what the man looked like, how tall he was, what direction Head gone, but I could tell from his eyes Head heard too many stories that ended without answers. They sent a car to cruise the area, but in a place like that, with 100 hollows and 1,000 ways into the woods, there wasn't much they could do. In the days that followed, my parents stopped arguing about whether the city was too dangerous or the country was safer. They were united on one thing. I was never to go near that hollow again. For a while, they drove me to school themselves, even when it meant rearranging shifts and losing sleep. Later, they bought me a used bike from a neighbor to replace the one he'd lost, but I didn't ride it much. The joy had gone out of it. The road didn't feel like freedom anymore. It felt like a thin strip of safety surrounded by something hungry. A few weeks later, everything tilted again. I came home from school one afternoon and saw my mom standing frozen in the doorway, her hand over her mouth. My dad was on the porch, staring down at something like it might explode. Leaning against the railing, propped up as neatly as if someone had just parked it there, was my old bike. Same bent reflector, same sticker on the frame, ID half peeled off, same scuffed seat. The only difference was a length of gray rope tied carefully around the handlebars in a loose bow. I don't remember if I screamed or if that's just how I recall it, but I do remember the way my dad swallowed hard, his face going pale. The sheriff came back out, took the bike, and said they'd dust it for prints. But if anything ever came of that, no one told us. Within a month, my parents put the house up for sale. We moved into a rental closer to town, and they never talked about going back. We don't really talk about any of it now. If it comes up at all, it's in half-finished sentences that trail off into silence, or in the way my mom still tells my younger cousins, with this desperate edge in her voice, to stick to the main road, to stay where people can see them. I moved away from those mountains eventually, but I can't shake them. Every time I see a missing person flyer, or a narrow dirt road disappearing into the trees, my chest tightens the way it did that day in the hollow. I still think about the rope on that tree, the shoe in the gravel, the tally marks on that man's arms, and the way he said, "I'll find him," like it was a promise he'd made to himself. I don't know if I was the first kid he followed out there, or the last, but I know I was lucky to come out of those woods at all. If you've ever grown up in the mountains, or had a moment where your gut told you to turn back and you didn't listen, I'd honestly like to hear about it. Drop a comment and tell me if this hits a little too close to home, or if you think I should have trusted my parents and stayed on the road from the start. Story 2. I was 29 when I moved back to my parents' place in the Appalachians. Old enough to know that life doesn't care about your plans, and young enough to still be embarrassed by how hard mine had crashed. I'd spent years chasing this blurry dream of being a writer, doing freelance pieces and a little copy work in the city until the money ran thin and the emails stopped coming. And when my mom called one night and told me my dad's back was getting worse and they were having trouble keeping up with the farm, it felt less like a choice and more like gravity pulling me home. They lived in a narrow valley outside a small mountain town, a patchwork of cornfields, hay, and tree lines stitched between two ridges, with a gravel drive that wound past the barn and up to the old white farmhouse. The closest neighbor, a widow named Mrs. Klein, lived a 10-minute walk away on the other side of the hill, and you could go an entire day without hearing anything but the occasional logging truck groaning up the road and the wind moving through the trees. After the noise and grind of the city, the slow pace felt like a mercy at first. My days settled into a rhythm. Help Dad with the chores before the heat set in, fix what needed fixing, keep an eye on the crops, then sit at my laptop in the evenings in the little bedroom under the dormer on the top floor, trying to turn this quiet, hollow part of the world into something worth reading. Night was when I worked best, and my parents didn't mind. The third floor kept my typing and late-night pacing away from their door, and from up there I could look out over the fields toward the dark line of trees that marked the edge of our land. For the first week or two, nothing felt strange. The silence at night was deep but not unfriendly, the sort of silence that lets your thoughts float to the surface. Then, slowly, things started to change. It began with a shape. Every evening, right around the time the sun slipped behind the ridge and the sky turned that washed-out orange, I'd glance out my window and see a figure standing at the far edge of our cornfield where the last row met the tree line. At first, I barely registered it. I assumed it was someone from the neighboring property, maybe cutting through or checking fence lines. But the more I watched, the more it bothered me. The person never seemed to be doing anything. They just stood there between two rows of corn, motionless, like a scarecrow someone had forgotten to take down. From that distance, I couldn't make out details, no face, no age, not even which way they were facing, just a dark silhouette against the dull gold of the field. I told myself it was nothing. People stood and stared at the land all the time out here. That's what I thought until the night I realized it wasn't a scarecrow at all. I'd stayed up later than usual writing, the room lit only by my desk lamp, and when I finally leaned back and rubbed my eyes, I caught sight of the figure again. On impulse, I stood and moved closer to the glass, letting my eyes adjust to the dim. I must have stared for a full minute, and just when I started to think maybe my mind was playing tricks on me, the figure shifted its weight. A small but unmistakable movement. My stomach dropped. Somebody was out there, standing still in that exact spot, night after night, watching nothing or watching us. For a while, I tried to rationalize it. My mom had mentioned that Mrs. Klein had a grown son who drifted in and out of her life, and I pictured some socially awkward guy walking the boundary of their land the way my dad always had, checking things he didn't want to talk about. The thought of some lonely, weird neighbor pacing his property line was unnerving, but not terrifying. I told myself it was probably him and went back to my laptop, but the words wouldn't come as easily. Every time the house creaked, I wondered if it was just old wood or if the sound carried from down by the field. A few days later, I noticed the second thing. Where the corn met the fence past the barn, someone had tied a bundle of sticks together and propped it up on a fence post. 3 crooked twigs lashed into a crude little figure with arms too long for its body. At first I assumed it was something my dad had rigged to mark a break in the fence line or a low spot. But when I asked him about it that afternoon, he frowned and said he had no idea what I was talking about. We walked out together, and sure enough, it was gone. The post was empty. Just a bit of string dangling there and a pair of small, muddy footprints in the grass that didn't match my boots or my dad's. That was the first time I felt that specific kind of cold that starts in your spine and leaks outward, but I still tried to push it away. Farms have trespassers, sometimes kids, hunters, drifters. It didn't have to mean anything. What really got under my skin was how the figure began to move closer. Not while I was watching, not with any visible motion that I could point to, but every evening, when that same hour rolled around, they would be a few yards nearer the house, tucked between a different pair of rows. It was so gradual that if I hadn't been staring for days, I might have missed it. One night they were at the tree line, another night a little deeper in the field, and then, suddenly, maybe a dozen rows away from the back fence, always still, always silent. The first time I saw them that close, I felt something like anger bubbling up under the fear. This wasn't just some person minding their business anymore. This felt deliberate. That next morning over coffee, I told my parents what I'd been seeing. My mom's first reaction was to brush it off. She said it was probably Mrs. Klein's son. That had always been a bit different, and that he liked to walk when the weather was cooler. She said it gently, with this careful softness that told me she didn't want me to worry. My dad, on the other hand, just grunted, the way he does when he's filing something away to think about later. They both told me the same thing in different words. Let it be. Don't go looking for trouble. But it's hard to ignore trouble when it's standing in your field every night. A couple evenings later, I was in the barn finishing up with the animals and the last of the equipment when I heard a soft tap, tap, tap on the barn doors. It was just after sundown, and the yard lights hadn't kicked in yet, which made the twilight feel thicker than it should have. For a second, I thought it was a branch in the wind, but the tapping came again, measured and intentional. I wiped my hands on my jeans and walked toward the doors, calling out that we were closed up for the night in that half-joking way you talk to the dark when you're not sure if there's anyone listening. When I pulled the doors open, there was no one there, just the yard, the shadow of the house, and the corn beyond. What there was, though, were 3 greasy handprints smeared high on the wood, higher than I could reach without stretching, fingers splayed dark with what looked like old oil mixed with dirt. They weren't ours. My dad and I always washed up before we touched the doors. I stood there, staring at them until a shiver snapped me out of it. I didn't tell my parents that part. I washed it off with a rag and pretended it hadn't happened. Some things are easier to ignore if you never say them out loud. The next escalation came a few days later. I was in the barn again, storing tools, when I realized that the long-handled hay hook my dad favored, the one he used every morning, was missing from its usual nail on the wall. It was heavy and old, with a wooden handle worn smooth from use, and it wasn't the kind of thing either of us misplaced. I spent 20 minutes checking every corner of that barn, crawling behind the tractor, looking under benches, checking the loft. But it was just gone. I chalked it up to my dad having moved it and forgot, even though that didn't feel right. The following evening, when I glanced out my window at dusk like I did every night now, I saw something glinting near the edge of the field. The figure was there again, closer than ever, a dark column between the rows. For a moment I thought I was imagining the glint, but when I squinted, I realized what I was looking at. The missing hay hook, jammed upright into the dirt between 2 corn stalks, handle pointed toward the house like an arrow. I couldn't see the person clearly enough to make out features, but I knew in that instant that whoever they were doing all of this on purpose. This wasn't some confused neighbor. This was someone who wanted us to know they were there. I finally reached my limit. The next night, I didn't just watch from the window. I waited until the sun had dropped low and the light went that melted copper color. Then I went downstairs, slipped on my boots, grabbed a flashlight from the hook in the mudroom, and stepped outside. The air was cooler than it had been all day, carrying that faint smell of earth and dry corn. From the yard, the field looked like a wall. The rows lined up so straight it made my eyes ache. I could feel my parents moving around inside the house, the vague clatter of dishes, the hum of the television. I walked toward the fence, each step feeling heavier than the last. At first, I couldn't see him. Then, as my eyes adjusted, I spotted the same figure standing near the far corner of the property line, off to the right of the barn. He wasn't as far as had been before. He stood just beyond the fence now, right where our land ended and the neighbors began, half hidden in shadow. He was turned toward the house. That was all I needed to know. My heart was pounding. But I forced myself to climb through the fence and take a few steps into the field, gravel and dirt crunching under my boots. I called out, not a challenge so much as a demand to know who he was, but my voice sounded thin in the open air. The figure reacted instantly. He didn't wave, didn't speak. He just spun and bolted between the rows, vanishing into the corn with a speed that didn't match his stillness. I'd like to say I chased him properly, but the truth is I jogged forward a few yards, saw nothing but stalks and shadows, and froze. The corn swallowed him whole. I stood there a long moment, listening to my pulse in my ears, knowing full well there was no way I'd go blindly into that maze after a stranger who'd been playing games around our house. I backed away, climbed the fence again, and went inside. That night, after my parents went to bed, I lay awake upstairs, staring at the ceiling, feeling like I'd invited something to come a little closer. The following morning, I walked over to see Mrs. Klein. Her place was older than ours, the farmhouse leaning a little, her porch crowded with potted plants and old rocking chairs that never seemed to get used. When she opened the door, I could see the surprise on her face at having someone just show up before 9 a.m. I told her as gently as I could that someone had been out near the property line at night, that I'd assumed it was family from her place, and I wanted to make sure everything was all right. She listened with this pinched look like she was trying to place a memory that wouldn't come. Then she shook her head and told me she hadn't been out after dark in months, her knees wouldn't allow it, and that she lived alone. When I asked about her son, she hesitated, then said Head moved out years ago and was somewhere in Ohio last she heard. She hadn't seen him in a long time. As she spoke, a little knot of dread tightened in my chest. Whoever I'd seen wasn't hers to explain away. I walked back along the dirt road with the sun high and bright overhead, but everything felt colder. I told my parents what Shed said, and this time they didn't shrug it off. My mom told me quietly we should probably call the sheriff, and my dad, ever practical, pointed out that whoever it was hadn't actually done anything they could arrest him for yet. He told me if I saw the guy again, I should wake him up and Head take care of it. I agreed, but deep down I wasn't sure what take care of it meant in his mind, and part of me didn't want to find out. For a few days after that, the figure didn't show. I kept checking my window at dusk, half hoping, half fearing I'd see that silhouette again. But the field remained empty, just rows of corn and the darkening line of the woods. The yard felt like itself again. I almost convinced myself that whoever it was had moved on, that maybe the simple act of being seen had been enough to scare him off. The tension in my shoulders started to ease, just a little. Then, one humid night, the lights went out. I was in the barn again, finishing up some small task I probably could have left until morning, when the world dropped into black. The overhead bulb blinked and died, and a second later the glow from the house windows vanished too. It wasn't a flicker, it was a hard cut. The kind of sudden darkness that makes your brain think for a split second that you've gone blind. I stood there, frozen, with my hand still on a rake, listening. No thunder, no wind, no storm. Just silence. Then, faint and far away at first, but unmistakable, I heard it. The soft, deliberate rustle of something moving through the cornfield. It wasn't the random swaying you get when the wind kicks up. This was directional, a steady push and shift, like a body forcing its way between the stalks. I felt for my phone in my back pocket, cursing myself when my fingers met nothing but denim I'd left it charging in my room. There was a small flashlight hanging by the barn door, and I fumbled for it in the dark, my hands clumsy, knocking into tools before my fingers finally closed around the plastic handle. When the beam finally cut through the black, it felt like the world narrowed to that one pale circle of light. I stepped outside the barn, the gravel cool under my boots, and swung the beam toward the field. The sound stopped. For a few seconds, there was nothing but the chirp of insects and my own ragged breathing. Then the rustling started again, closer now, somewhere near the edge of the yard. I turned the beam just in time to catch movement at the waist-high edge of the corn. A man stepped out of the rows like had been part of them all along. Seeing him up close stripped away the protective vagueness of distance. He was taller than me by a few inches, wiry, with pale skin stretched tight over sharp cheekbones. His hair was patchy and uneven, buzzed short in some places and longer in others, like he'd cut it himself without a mirror. He wore dirty overalls over a stained t-shirt, both streaked with the kind of grime that doesn't wash out in one go. His eyes caught the flashlight beam and flashed for a split second, not with anything supernatural, just that flat, reflective look that comes from someone who's been staring too long and too hard at something only they can see. His expression wasn't blank exactly. It was intent, focused entirely on me. I dropped the beam for a second, and that's when I saw what he was holding. In one hand, he gripped a rusty digging fork, the kind with 4 long, sharp tines used to break up hard soil. The metal was dark with old earth, and his knuckles were white around the handle, like he'd been holding it for a long time. Fear is a strange thing. Part of you wants to stand still and stare, and the other part wants to run so hard your lungs tear. My body chose the latter. Without saying a word, I turned and ran, aiming not for the house, but for the field. Some stupid instinct telling me I could lose him in the rows the way he'd disappeared from me so many times. Behind me, I heard the pound of his footsteps as he gave chase, the fork clinking faintly with each stride. I plunged into the corn, the leaves slapping my face and arms, the flashlight beam jerking wildly with my movement. The ground between the rows was uneven and full of hidden roots, and more than once I nearly went down. I could hear him crashing after me, closer than I wanted to admit. At the next intersection of rows, I cut hard to the left and killed the flashlight, throwing myself down between the stalks and pressing my body flat to the dry dirt. My heart hammered against my ribs, so loud I was afraid he'd hear it. In the darkness, I lay there listening as he ran past, the sound of his footsteps slowing, then stopping not far from where I was hiding. I heard him breathing, hard and wet, and then the faint scrape of metal against metal as he tapped the fork against something, maybe the irrigation pipe, maybe a rock. He stood there for what felt like forever, just on the other side of the stalks, close enough that I could see the faint outline of his legs through the gaps. Then he started mumbling. I couldn't catch every word, but I heard enough to make my blood run cold. He was talking about how he had to be out here somewhere, how he always came back eventually, how this time he'd be ready. I didn't know if he meant me specifically or some other target in his mind, but either way, I lay there in the dirt and realized I was listening to someone who had built a whole private world around the idea of waiting for and catching someone else. Eventually, he moved on, his footsteps receding slowly into the maze of corn. I stayed put, muscles shaking, until my legs started to tingle from being pinned under me. When I finally dared to move again, I did it in small increments, sliding on my stomach like a kid playing army, until I reached the end of the row and could peek out. The yard was still black. The house was a hulking shadow against the darker line of the ridge. I didn't see him anywhere. I took my chance. I bolted for the back porch, my lungs burning, my mind racing ahead to all the ways this could go wrong. Miraculously, I made it inside, slammed the door, and locked it. My parents woke up as I stumbled through the kitchen, my words tumbling over themselves as I told them we needed to call the sheriff. While my dad went to reset the breaker, knowing full well someone had likely tampered with it, the deputies arrived and swept the property. They didn't find the man, but they did find the cause of the outage. The outside breaker panel was soaked, water sloshing in the bottom like someone had dumped a bucket into it. The perfect way to kill the power without making a sound. The sheriff took it seriously after that. Had heard enough stories about stalkers, drifters, and men who don't let go of their obsessions in these hills to know this wasn't some harmless oddball. He arranged for extra patrols to swing by occasionally, and my parents and I spent the next day installing motion lights, adding locks, and finally doing what we should have done sooner, leaving the porch light on at night like a beacon. For the rest of the month, nothing else happened. No figure in the field at dusk, no stick dolls on the fence, no handprints, no missing tools. Life slid back towards something like normal. My parents hired a younger guy from town to help with the heavier chores. My dad's back stopped screaming at him quite so much, and my mom went back to humming absent-mindedly while she cooked. I convinced myself, as much as anyone can, that the man had moved on to some other forgotten place, that maybe Wed just been unlucky enough to cross his path during a bad stretch. Eventually, I left. Not because of him, at least not on paper. A job opened up in another state, with a small publishing house, and I couldn't pass it up. Leaving felt wrong and necessary at the same time. I hugged my parents, told them I'd call, and drove away from the valley with the fields shrinking in my rearview mirror, the corn replaced by hills, the hills by interstates and billboards. But the mountains never really let go of you once they've wrapped themselves around your life. Even now, in a different city with different problems. I'll sometimes wake up in the middle of the night convinced there's someone standing at the edge of my vision, just beyond the window, waiting for me to look out. He'll lie there listening, my heart pounding, replaying those weeks over and over. The figure that stepped a little closer each night. The stick figure on the fence post, the missing hay hook, the greasy handprints, the man with the digging fork and the way his voice sounded when he muttered to himself about finding him. I still don't know who he was or how long he'd been watching our place before I noticed. I don't know if he ever came back after I left, if the extra locks and the motion lights were enough to make him lose interest, or if he just turned his attention to someone else's field, someone else's bedroom window. What I do know is that there's a particular kind of dread that comes from realizing the thing you're afraid of isn't a ghost or a legend, but a very real person with all the time in the world on their hands. If you've ever had a similar feeling of being quietly watched, of seeing the same stranger a little too often on the edge of your world, you'd honestly like to hear it. Drop a comment and tell me if this reminded you of anything from your own life, or if you think him overreacting to what was just a man in a field with a tool he never got the chance to use. Story 3. I moved to the mountains because I thought I needed quiet, not realizing that sometimes the quiet is exactly what lets the worst things get close. I was 30 and burned out from a string of dead-end jobs in the city, and when a friend of a friend told me about a cheap rental outside a small town in the Appalachians, it felt like the universe throwing me a rope. The place was an old 2-story house at the very end of a narrow, cracked, blacktop road that wound around the ridge and simply stopped in front of my driveway, surrounded by woods on 3 sides and an endless field on the 4th. The field started just beyond a rickety wooden fence, a few feet from the back deck, a stretch of corn that climbed up the slope in neat rows until it met the tree line. The stalks close enough that when the wind blew, it sounded like whispers pressing right up against the house. There were no real neighbors, not in the way I was used to. The closest occupied property was a mile or so down the road, out of sight, and first responders were something you'd hear long before you ever saw their lights. The landlord, an older guy named Duval with a sunburned neck and nicotine-stained fingers, had shrugged when I asked why the rent was so low, saying something about too much upkeep for most folks and people not liking the drive in winter, then tossed me the keys and told me to call if anything broke that I couldn't fix myself. As I walked through the empty rooms that first day, scuffed floors, faded wallpaper, a faint smell of damp under the cleaner, I noticed a couple things that bothered me in a way I couldn't put my finger on. Faint scratches low on the back door, like someone had dragged something metal across it over and over, and a single muddy child sock wedged between the steps and the railing off the back deck, stiff with age. I told myself it was just junk left by whoever had rented before me, tossed the sock in the trash, and tried not to think about it. For the first few months, I actually liked the isolation. My job was remote, some mindless data work that I could do with music in my ears, and in the evenings I'd sit on the deck with a beer, watching the sky turn from pink to purple behind the ridges while the corn swayed in waves. The nights were dark in a way you never get near a city. No street lights, no traffic, just the house, the field, the trees, and this overwhelming black beyond the porch light that made the world feel both huge and very, very small. It was October when everything changed. The kind of early cold snap where the air has teeth but the days are still bright. One of those nights, the wind was up and the sky was that heavy, low gray that makes you think it might snow even though you know it won't. I remember actually feeling good that evening. I'd finished my work early, warmed up some leftovers, and stepped out on the back deck with a cigarette and my hands shoved in my jacket pockets, looking out over the field as the last light drained from the sky. The corn was dry and brittle by then, the tops gone brown, the whole hillside shifting and rattling as the wind pushed through it. I was just about to go back inside when I heard it. At first I thought it was some kind of animal call. These mountains are full of strange cries at night, but a second later my brain caught up and translated the sound into something I can't properly explain without my chest tightening. It was a scream, high-pitched, sharp, unmistakably human. It cut across the field from somewhere near the middle rows, bounced off the ridge, and hit me so hard my legs actually locked. It sounded like a kid. You can tell when something is just noise and when it's pure panic, and this wasn't one of those sounds you can shrug off. Before I even realized what I was doing, I flicked the cigarette off the deck, half ran back into the kitchen, grabbed my old 30-06 from where I kept it in the corner, checked that it was unloaded but with ammunition in my pocket just in case, and shoved my phone into my hoodie. I'm not a hero, but the idea of a child screaming for help that close and me doing nothing felt worse than anything that might be in that field. I hopped the fence instead of bothering with the gate, boots slipping in the damp grass. And for a moment I just stood there at the edge of the corn, trying to pinpoint where the scream had come from. The wind had picked up again, tossing the sound of dry leaves around until it was impossible to tell what was natural and what wasn't. "Hey," I called out, feeling stupid and desperate at the same time, telling whoever it was to yell again so I could find them. Nothing answered me, just the scrape of husks against each other in the dark. I hesitated, then picked a row at random and plunged into it, the stalks closing in on either side of me like walls. I used my phone's flashlight, the thin beam jittering over the dirt as I walked, rifle slung over my shoulder, heart pounding so hard it felt like it was rattling the corn with every step. The field was disorienting. Every row looked the same. The rows ran together in my peripheral vision, and it was way too easy to forget which direction the house was in if I didn't keep stopping to turn and orient myself. At one point I paused and listened, and that's when I heard it again, the scream, farther away this time, but still clearly a child's, drawn out and raw. It made the hair on my neck stand up. I cut across 2 more rows, leaves slapping me in the face, my brain buzzing with all the worst possibilities. A kid who'd wandered off from some distant farmhouse, a runaway, some hurt child I was already too late to help. When I reached what I thought was the general area, everything went dead quiet. No crying, no rustling, just my breathing. I called out again and again, but nothing answered. No half-sobbing voice, no help me, no movement, just wind. Eventually, I dialed 911 with shaking fingers, trying to explain to the dispatcher where exactly I was, then stumbled my way back toward the house to wait by the driveway, calling out every few steps in case the kid had followed the sound of my voice. When the deputies finally rolled up the road, a pair of SUVs with their light bars silent but flashing, the field looked completely ordinary, just a dark hillside under a crooked moon. I walked them back out, retracing my steps as best I could, and we spent the next half hour moving up and down the rows, our flashlights sweeping over dirt and stalk and nothing else. No footprints I hadn't made, no torn fabric, no small shoe in the mud. One of the deputies, Harper, asked me if I was sure it hadn't been a fox or a bobcat or something else that can sound weird at night when you're alone. And I heard the skepticism buried under the question. I told him no, that I knew what those sounded like and this had been different. The more I defended myself, the more crazy I felt. But I stuck to it. In the end, there was nothing for them to find and nothing obvious to do. They told me to call again if I heard something, gave each other that look people give when they think you're spooked but harmless, and left. I stood in the driveway, watching their taillights vanish between the trees, feeling more alone on that ridge than I ever had before. That should have been the end of it. A weird, unsettling night I could file away under country living and eventually laugh about. But over the next few days, little things started happening that didn't feel like coincidence. The first was the sound. Every night after that, usually sometime between midnight and 2, it'd wake up to this faint, creaking noise in the house. Floorboards shifting, like someone was taking slow, careful steps downstairs. Old houses make noise, and I know that rationally. But this sounded deliberate. It would go on for a few minutes, then stop entirely, leaving me staring at the ceiling with my heart in my throat. More than once, I crept out onto the landing, half expecting to see someone standing at the bottom of the stairs. But there was never anything there, just the faint smell of cold air seeping in around the back door. The second thing was something I could actually see. 3 times that week I woke up, went to make coffee, and found a small, neat pile of corn husks arranged on the back deck outside the sliding door, right against the glass. Not scattered like they'd blown there, but stacked, like someone had set them down on purpose, each pile about the size of a dinner plate. I swept them off with a broom the first 2 times and told myself the wind had done something weird. The third time, though, I noticed a small, muddy footprint smudged on the deckboard beside them, not big enough to be mine, not bare enough to be a boot. I scrubbed that away too, but it stayed in my head. The scream didn't come back right away. For almost 2 weeks, there was nothing but those faint house noises and the husk piles and this crawling feeling at the back of my neck when I looked out at the field at night. Then came the fire. It was another windy evening, colder than before, the kind of night where the stars feel sharp and close. I'd stayed up late watching some mindless show in the living room, and I was just about to call it a night when a flicker of orange caught the corner of my eye. At first I thought it was a reflection from the TV, but when I muted the sound and looked again, the orange was still there, pulsing faintly against the ceiling. A bad feeling flooded me before I even made it to the stairs. I ran up to the small bedroom I was using and went straight to the window that faced the field. What I saw made my stomach drop. A patch of fire had bloomed out in the corn, maybe 40 yards from the fence, low but spreading fast. The flames whipped sideways by the wind. I don't remember exactly what I said, but I know it wasn't fit for polite company. Training from a lifetime of fire safety drills kicked in all at once. I grabbed my phone, dialed 911 with fingers that wouldn't stay steady, stammered out my address and the words field, fire, then bolted back downstairs. There was an old hose coiled on a rack by the side of the house, and I had this desperate hope that it would be long enough to reach. I cranked the spigot, dragged the hose across the yard, and practically threw myself over the fence, sprinting through the first rows of corn as the dry stalks brushed my arms. The hose barely reached. If the fire had started 10 feet farther out, I wouldn't have been able to touch it, but this time, luck was on my side. I squeezed the nozzle and went to work, spraying the base of the flames, trying to carve a wet line around them before they could jump. The heat was so intense, it felt like my eyebrows were going to crisp, and the combination of cold air and hot steam made everything hazy and hard to see. But eventually the flames shrank and guttered out, leaving only smoking stalks and that harsh, wet burn smell lingering in the air. I stood there shaking, soaked through, chest heaving, the hose still running in my hand. For a moment, it was just me and the ruined patch of field and the dark wall of corn beyond it. Then I saw movement. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, some leftover flicker from the fire, but when I looked up toward the house, my blood ran cold. In the second-story window, my bedroom window, there was a figure, a person, standing where I had been minutes earlier, silhouetted by the faint indoor light it left on. I couldn't make out features, just the shape of a head and shoulders, the outline of someone standing very still and very much inside my home. Any rational thought I had evaporated. I dropped the hose, water spraying aimlessly into the dirt, and sprinted back toward the house, slipping once on the wet grass and catching myself with one hand. By the time I hit the deck and shoved the sliding door open, my heart felt like it was going to tear itself out of my chest. The first thing that hit me when I stepped inside was the smell, this sour mix of sweat and overturned food and something metallic. The second was the sound of glass crunching under my boots. The kitchen looked like it had been hit by a storm. Cabinet doors hung open, contents spilled out onto the floor, drawers yanked so hard a couple had come off their tracks. The fridge stood wide open, milk and condiments and leftovers dumped out, some of it smeared across the linoleum in dark streaks. A couple plates lay shattered in the doorway, and a chair had been knocked over hard enough to leave a dent in the wall. Whoever had been in my house hadn't just broken in. They'd gone through it like they were looking for something or trying to make a point. Before I could even fully process the scene, I heard the front door slam. I ran toward the noise, nearly slipping again. But by the time I yanked the door open and lunged out onto the porch, the yard was empty. The flash of motion you expect to catch at the edge of your vision wasn't there. No figure running down the drive, no car peeling away, no crashing through the trees. Just darkness and the faint glow of the field, still smoldering behind me. I stood there on the porch, lungs burning, not sure if I wanted to scream or throw up. When I finally forced myself back inside and started moving from room to room, the damage took on an even uglier shape. The living room had been ransacked too, couch cushions slashed, books pulled off shelves, a lamp knocked over and left in pieces. Upstairs, in the bedroom, the mattress had been dragged half off the frame, sheets twisted and torn, dresser drawers overturned. On the far wall, near the floor, someone had smeared 3 sets of handprints in what looked like mud. Small, child-sized hands, pressed into the paint in a vertical line, one above the other, as if marking height. Whether it was truly mud or not, I never asked the police to confirm. That was the third horror detail that dug its nails into my brain and stayed there. The deputies took it seriously this time. Between the attempted arson and the clear evidence of a break-in, there was nothing ambiguous, or maybe you misheard about it anymore. They swept the house, the yard, the field, brought a couple of dogs who sniffed around the burned patch and the porch, and then circled uselessly, the trail already too cold or too scrambled. One of them found a melted plastic gas can half hidden near the back of the property and a small pile of charred wooden matches, like someone had knelt there and taken their time. Another pointed out that the breaker box on the side of the house looked like it had been tampered with recently, which might explain why my porch light had flickered earlier in the week. They asked me the same questions over and over. Had I pissed anyone off? Did I owe anyone money? Did I know anyone? And I want to scare me out here. And every time I told them no, that there was no one I could think of, that I hardly knew anyone in town at all. The more I said it, the stranger it felt. It's one thing to have an enemy you can name, another to realize that if someone is fixated on you, it might be purely because you were there, alone and easy. After that night, I didn't really sleep. I'd doze off for 20 minutes at a time and jerk awake at the smallest noise, convinced I'd hear those careful floorboard creaks starting up again. I started keeping the rifle loaded and within reach, leaned against the nightstand, a habit I'd never had before. I bought heavier locks for the doors, installed a motion light on the side of the house and one at the end of the driveway, and added a cheap security camera that sent grainy clips to my phone. The piles of husks stopped appearing on the deck, which almost made things worse because it meant whoever had been creeping around out there either knew I was watching more closely or had gotten what they wanted and moved on. The scream never came back, not in that same piercing, human way, but sometimes at night, especially when the wind blew from the direction of the ridge. I'd hear a faint, high sound carried on it and feel my whole body lock up until I could convince myself it was just some distant dog or animal. I didn't last much longer in that house. On paper, I left because the commute to the nearest town was too much and because I found a slightly better job offer closer to civilization. But that's only half true. The real reason is that one night, maybe a month after the break-in, I stopped at the gas station off the main highway and caught sight of a missing child flyer, taped to the register, a boy, 9 or 10, from 2 counties over. The clerk said it had been up for weeks, that the kid had gone missing near his grandparents' place at the edge of a big property, lots of field and trees. Not too different from where you stay, right? He added casually. Not knowing anything about me, I bought my coffee, nodded, and walked out with my heartbeat ringing in my ears. I kept seeing that paper handout next to the image of those small, muddy handprints on my bedroom wall, and realized I wasn't willing to wait around to learn whether those two things were connected or just one more coincidence I'd never be able to untangle. I moved out a few weeks later, packed my things into the back of an aging pickup, and drove away from the ridge without looking back at the field. I don't know who was out there that night, whether the scream I heard belonged to a real child in trouble or a recording played by someone who knew how to weaponize empathy, whether the piles of husks and the handprints were meant as warnings or trophies. What I do know is that the scariest thing I've ever experienced wasn't some ghost or legend, but the realization that a stranger with time and patience had been studying my routines, waiting for the right moment to draw me out and crawl into the space I considered safe. If you've ever lived somewhere isolated or had that gut feeling that someone was watching from just beyond the light, I honestly want to hear about it. Drop a comment and tell me if this reminds you of anything you've gone through, or if you think I should have trusted my instincts and gotten off that ridge the first time I heard that scream rip through the corn.